Speaker. It's a pleasure to participate in this very important and timely debate, and a particular pleasure to follow the Right Honourable Member for Camborne and Redruth, who I thought made a very considered speech, as ever. He's very learned in this particular policy field, and I'd like to actually elaborate a little bit and follow on his one of his final points there about food security, and especially the emphasis on horticulture and reshoring some of that production in the UK, because I think food security is something that doesn't always get the attention it demands in this place, and indeed in wider political debate. It's a very important matter, of course, of life and death, but it is something that I feel warrants even more parliamentary scrutiny and debate in future. But if we begin then by considering the current state of affairs, and in that regard, the UK Government's Food Security Report is incredibly useful. It sets out the current situation as regards food production and food consumption, as well as exports and imports. And I was quite taken by some of its findings that the UK's production to supply ratio, for example, for all food in 2020 was some 60% and 76% for indigenous type food. Perhaps more relevant and more widely understood, of course, is the actual consumption of UK-produced food, and that statistic stands closer to 54%, as of course part of UK food products are exported. Now, the point I make on this now is statistics, they're very hard to interpret and sometimes can tell a whole array of different stories. The one thing I would say about that 54% of UK-produced food actually consumed is that it compares to a 1984 figure of 78%. Now, changing dietary preferences, changing climate, different consumer habits, what have you, have a very heavy bearing on this story. But the trend, I think, is quite important, that from a peak in the mid-1980s, the production to supply ratio has declined into the early 2000s and has remained quite stable ever since. Of course, food security is not a simple matter. It is multifaceted and has various different contingent factors. But again, the UK Government's Food Security Report has a very useful definition, which I think conveys the complexity. Food security, it notes, encompasses the state of global agriculture and markets on which the UK is reliant, the sources of raw materials and foodstuffs in the UK and abroad, the manufacturing, wholesale and retail industries that ultimately bring food to shelves and plates, and their complex supply chains of inputs and logistics, and the systems of inspection that allow consumers to be confident that their food is safe, authentic and of a high standard. Now, if we consider that definition for a moment, as detailed as it is, immediately a few risks to food security spring to mind. We've heard some of them already in this debate this evening. We've heard of the surge in input prices and cost of commodities, and the way that has had a big influence on the viability of farm businesses. We've also heard about changing climate in the UK and the way in which flooding has had a significant impact on agricultural production in the UK. But I also think it's quite important to bear in mind that the impact of a changing climate will also have an impact on those markets abroad from which the UK imports so much of its food. And especially of relevance here is that, as the Right Honourable Member who spoke before me outlined, different sectors will be more exposed to these import markets or these foreign markets than others. If we take, for example, the fruit and vegetable sector as a particular case in point, we depend quite a bit on foreign markets for our fruit and veg. The UK produces over 50% of vegetables consumed domestically, but only 16% of our fruit. And 93% of domestic consumption of fresh vegetables was fulfilled by domestic and European production, while fruit supply is more widely spread across the EU, Africa, the Americas and the UK. Now, some of these foreign markets are those areas of the world in which we know will suffer from climate change, and their ability to produce much of this food that we import will be impacted by climate change. And that's not to consider, of course, the impact that the unknown impact of geopolitical instability will have on some of these supply chains. You know, the war in Ukraine has already been mentioned, but we need also remember, of course, that some of these shocks are unexpected and we cannot anticipate, such as, for example, the disruption more recently in the Red Sea trade routes. And so for that reason, I very much welcome the government's commitment to monitoring food security through this new statutory index. And I think it would warrant then an annual debate to coincide with updates of the index so that we can properly scrutinise this very important matter. Now, if we consider all of these facts and potential threats and risks, I think it leads us to this conclusion that actually we need to not only maintain domestic food production, but also actually increase food production so that we can gain greater self-sufficiency in many of the food products that UK consumers eat. Now, whilst I focused so far on some of the external factors, we need to bear in mind, of course, there are many domestic factors that have an impact on domestic food capacity. And I'm afraid to say that there are a combination of factors that are conspiring at present to force many farmers in Wales out of the industry. Now, domestic agricultural support policy, for example, is a very big part to play in this regard, in addition to public procurement of food contracts, which has already been mentioned by another speaker. I'm afraid the financial position of Welsh farms just underlines the vulnerability of the sector in Wales and the importance of direct government support payments. Now, IBERS, the Research Institute at Aberystwyth University in my constituency, produces an annual farm business survey of farm incomes. And the most recent survey, detailing the 2022-2023 outturns, paints a very worrying picture of the state of many farms and farm models in Wales. It noted how hill, cattle and sheep farms made a profit of some £24,000 after rent and finance in that financial year, but excluding, of course, the cost of unpaid labour. And that compares to the average basic payment scheme payment for those farms of £26,000. Hill sheep farms paint a similar story. They made a profit after rent and finance of some £24,000 versus a BPS direct support payment of £31,577. The point I'm trying to make here is that direct support from the government through the BPS in this instance has served an incredibly important role in keeping many of these farms afloat. And the threat or the concern that I have is when there any reduction to that profit, many of these farms will find themselves unviable. I will, of course.
Giving way. He will know well that the Labour government in Wales is currently planning a subsidy scheme, a sustainable farming scheme, which by their own independently commissioned estimates will lead to roughly a 10% drop in livestock and a £122 million drop in revenue. That's income that farmers in Aberconwy tell me is simply the difference between them having a future and not. So what message does he have then for his Plaid Cymru colleagues in the Senedd who are propping up that Welsh Labour government through a cooperation agreement? Does he agree with me that tomorrow afternoon's budget vote might be a good opportunity for them to reconsider that cooperation?
Very grateful to my honourable friend from Aberconwy for making that intervention. I think he is right to state the fears of his farmers that are very much aligned with those expressed to me by farmers in Ceredigion, that the potential change of this policy is, quite frankly, the matter of life and death for their businesses. He tempts me to comment on some of the potential plans of my colleagues in the Senedd. I'll resist them, but I will say that I think it's important, given the gravity of the situation facing the Welsh agricultural industry, that's important that the SFS is changed. I would suggest that it should be paused to begin with so that we have time to devise a proper policy that is fit for the 21st century. And if my colleagues decide that they need to use every possible lever possible, then I would all power to their elbow. And if that means the demise of a cooperation agreement, I certainly shall not be mourning its passing. The point, though, is that the direct support for many of our farm businesses is crucial, and I think a point was made by the right honourable member for North Herefordshire earlier in the debate that much of the reality of some of this support is actually to ensure that the price of food on the market, on the supermarket shelves, is controlled in a manner. Now, yes, yeah.
I'm grateful to the honourable member for giving way. He was talking about direct support to farmers, and on that subject, I'd also like to talk briefly, ask him a question about direct support for local planning authorities, given how vital it is that farmers get quick answers from local planning authorities. My experience in Mid and East Devon is that they are earnest in their desire to prevent agricultural pollution affecting our streams and rivers. But I've had one farmer who's waited 20 months for a decision on a planning application in relation to the construction of a slurry store. Does he agree with me that we need the Westminster Government also to help local planning authorities so that we can get rapid answers to our farmers?
Well, I thank the Honourable Gentleman for that very important contribution, intervention. I think it is quite right. It's something we face in Wales as well, where some farm improvements and developments, indeed changes to comply with regulations, find obstacles in delays in planning. I think it's only right that planning authorities are sufficiently resourced to ensure that none of these obstacles are put in the way of progress. So I think he makes a very good point. If I can very briefly, Madam Deputy Speaker, for concluding, just turn to some of the wider issues that impact on domestic production that I think is worth repeating in this place, and those being the weaknesses of the current grocery supply code of practice and enforcement regime, and also then, of course, trade policy. I don't need to remind the House because I can see so many learned members here this evening, but farming is a long-term industry. These decisions have to be made on a very long-term basis. When it comes to the way in which the grocery supply chain operates, I'm afraid to say that it is the case that many of the retailers have found themselves in a position where they can exert undue influence and impact on farmers and growers to shift short-term risk onto their shoulders, much to the detriment of the wider industry. It's been stated in a previous debate in Westminster Hall last month that 95% of the food consumed in the UK is sold by just 12 retailers, which affords them this dominant position in the supply chain. And it means the farmers and growers receive quite a paltry margin when compared to that enjoyed by many of the retailers. Again, a point made far more eloquently by the Right Honourable Member for North Herefordshire. And so in addition to short-term inflation spikes and rising input costs, farmers are also at the present exposed to some unfair trading practices that arise from this imbalance. Now, at the debate last month, many members were present debating a petition that was brought forward by the Riverfoot Farming Campaign, which called on the government to strengthen the grocery code adjudicators so that it is empowered to take effective and punitive action against those committing unfair trading practices, to lower the turnover threshold so that the code applies to a greater number of retailers, and to enshrine the simple principle that retailers should give suppliers certainty that they will buy what they agreed to buy, pay what they agreed to pay, and to pay on time. What we're talking there, Madam Deputy Speaker, is just basic fairness, and specifically to spread out some of the risk and also the profit inherent in the food supply system more evenly across the supply chain. Finally then, it has already been mentioned, so I won't go into any detail, but the impact of trade policy. And concerns have been referenced already about the impact of the Australia Free Trade Deal on the sector in Wales and indeed in the UK. All I would want to say in addition to what has already been said is that in its approach to future trade policy, the UK government should urgently establish a set of core production standards for all food consumed in the UK to ensure that farmers and growers here are not disadvantaged by any future trade agreements. These standards could safeguard high-quality, climate-friendly markets that are open to imports from countries whose standards may differ from our own. But in addition, we've already mentioned the Food Security Index. The government could look to establish an annual free trade agreement assessment to quantify the cumulative impact of free trade agreements on trade balance, sourcing, standards and domestic food production. I know it's something that the farming unions in Wales would very much support. In conclusion then, Madam Deputy Speaker, what I think with regards to food security, it is a challenge that we will need to grapple with quite soon. And I think by supporting domestic production, not only for it to be maintained current levels, but actually to increase production so that we do gain greater self-sufficiency, we will in turn gain greater resilience to climate change, to the shocks also in a very uncertain world.